There is a kind of loneliness that is not weakness, it is not rejection, and it is not failure. There is a kind of loneliness that is born when the old version of you can no longer bear to keep breathing inside the same skin, and almost no one notices when it starts, because on the outside you just seem quieter, more distant, more selective, but inside something definitive happened, something that has no return. The empath that reached Sophia is no longer injured as before. He is no longer begging for understanding. He is no longer trying to save the world while abandoning himself. He has crossed his own shadow. He faced what he had avoided for years. He saw how much his kindness also hid fear, how much his sensitivity also hid escape, how much her love also hid need. And when that vision became impossible to deny, a silent death took place. That's why it becomes dangerous. Not because he wants to hurt anyone, not because he wants to prove something, but because it can no longer be manipulated by the need to belong. He no longer trades his soul for emotional crumbs. It no longer bends over backwards to fit into environments that diminish its essence. He is no longer afraid to be alone, and that changes everything. Few get here, few can bear to lose the old identity that kept them safe, because the old identity was known. It was comfortable, it was predictable. Sophia, as Jung insinuated when talking about the integration of the shadow, is not a prize. It's a crossing. It is the moment when consciousness stops blaming the world and begins to take on its own depth. It is the moment when you understand that your pain was never punishment, it was preparation. The loner who has reached this stage does not seek applause. He does not need to announce his awakening. Its transformation is silent, but it is absolute. There is a peace that is born after internal chaos, a serenity that only appears after the rupture, a dignity that only flourishes after symbolic death. And when that happens, the world can no longer pressure you with the same emotional threats as before. Maybe you're feeling it right now. Maybe you're realizing that you can't go back to who you were, that certain conversations have lost meaning, that certain dynamics seem too small for your current consciousness. This is not coldness. This is not pride. This is the silent ascension of those who have integrated parts of themselves that were previously hidden. Carl Jung said that the process of individuation is rare because it requires courage to cross one's own abyss. The empath that catches up with Sophia has crossed. He let the version he lived to please die. He left behind the identity built on fear of abandonment. He accepted that being a rare soul often means walking alone. And when the fear of being alone disappears, something is born that the world does not know how to control. It's not harshness. It is not arrogance. It is freedom. A freedom that does not depend on validation. A freedom that does not need witnesses. A freedom that transforms the lonely into someone whole. The most dangerous of the lonely is not the one who hides from the world. It is the one who no longer needs it to feel complete. He is the one who has found his own approval within himself. He is the one who went through the dark night and discovered that his light did not depend on anyone. If you feel that something old has died inside you and that a new identity begins to be born, it may not be the end. Perhaps it is the beginning of its rarest phase, because when Sophia wakes up, there is no going back. There is only integration. There is only freedom. There is only the awareness that you will never again accept to live by halves. The loneliness that doesn't hurt anymore. There is a phase in the life of the empath in which loneliness ceases to be a burden and becomes a sacred space. At first, he believed that being alone was a sign of rejection. He interpreted silence as abandonment. He felt that if no one was around, something was wrong with him. For years, he tried to compensate for this feeling by offering more than he received, offering boundless understanding, offering constant presence, offering parts of themselves that were never returned. But there was an invisible weariness growing inside, a tiredness that did not come from people. It came from his own attempt to remain accepted. It came from the constant effort not to be left behind. It came from the silent fear of not being enough. The pain of loneliness was not, in fact, fear of being alone. It was fear of not being chosen. And this is where the transformation begins. There is a moment when the equalizer stops. He realizes that his exhaustion is not the result of loving too much, but of abandoning himself too much. He understands that his surrender was not just generosity, it was an unconscious attempt to ensure permanence. This perception is not comfortable. It hurts, because it dismantles the narrative that he was just a victim of circumstances. He begins to see his own shadow. Carl Jung said that what we do not face within us manifests itself as destiny. The empath that does not integrate his shadow repeats patterns. He continues to look for unavailable people. He keeps trying to prove his worth. He continues to confuse intensity with connection. But when Sophia begins to awaken, something changes profoundly. Loneliness is no longer punishment, it becomes a revelation. He begins to realize that silence is not empty. Silence is space, space to listen, space to realize what it really feels like when no one is demanding anything from him. Space to discover that your identity doesn't depend on being needed. This is the first liberation. The empath begins to enjoy his own company, not because he gave up on love, but because he discovered that his presence is enough. He no longer feels urgency. He no longer feels despair. He feels stability. Few get here, because to love one's own loneliness, it is necessary to go through the initial pain that it causes. You have to endure the discomfort of not having emotional distractions. It is necessary to face thoughts that were previously muffled by the need for connection. And when he goes through this, something irreversible happens. Loneliness doesn't hurt anymore. It strengthens, it purifies, it reorganizes identity. He begins to realize that many of the connections he had were sustained by fear. Fear of being invisible, fear of being forgotten, fear of being replaced. Not now. Now he knows he can't be replaced because he's no longer trying to be like anyone else. He became whole. This is the silent ascent that Jung described in the process of individuation. It is not an external explosion. It is not an advertisement. It is an internal reorganization. The empath who reaches this point does not feel superior. He feels free. Free to choose, free to stay, free to go, free to love without losing yourself. And this freedom transforms your presence in the world. He doesn't run after it. He does not beg for understanding. He doesn't try to convince anyone of his worth. He simply is. And when someone simply is, loneliness ceases to be a threat. It becomes home. The death of the identity that begged for love. There is a version of the empath who lived for years trying to be indispensable. This version believed that if it was understanding enough, patient enough, strong enough, it would never be abandoned. This identity was built in silence. It was born out of small experiences of rejection, of moments when he felt he needed to adjust to be loved, from situations in which he learned that his needs were exaggerated. Then he began to ease his own pain. He began to accept less than he deserved. He began to believe that to love meant to endure. But no identity built on fear can survive when Sophia awakens. There comes a moment when the empath realizes that his generosity hid a deep insecurity. He realizes that his tolerance hid a fear of conflict. He realizes that his constant availability hid his dread of loneliness. This perception is the second death. It's not dramatic. It's not noisy. It is silent. He begins to say no internally, even before he says it externally. He begins to feel discomfort where he once felt obligation. He begins to recognize when he is cheating on himself. And that changes everything. because the identity that begged for love begins to lose strength. She can no longer survive within the new consciousness. The empath can no longer pretend that everything is fine when it is not. He can no longer accept emotional crumbs. It can no longer justify the absence of reciprocity. It's not anger. It's not resentment. It's lucidity. He understands that the love he sought outside was a reflection of the love he did not give to himself. This understanding does not generate guilt. It generates liberation. He begins to love himself silently. It begins to prioritize itself without announcing. He begins to choose relationships that do not require him to diminish. And that makes it rare, because most people prefer to maintain known identities rather than face symbolic death. Most prefer to remain who they have always been rather than go through the discomfort of transformation. But the empath that catches up with Sophia can't go back. He saw too much. He felt it too much. He integrated his shadow. And when the shadow is integrated, fear loses control. Now he doesn't love to be accepted. He loves because he is whole. And if love doesn't come with reciprocity, it doesn't fall apart. He remains. This is the true transformation of no return. It is not becoming cold. It is not becoming distant. It is to become complete. And when someone becomes complete, the world notices, because there is no more despair in your eyes. There is serenity. There is awareness. There is presence. The solitary person who has reached this stage is not isolated by pain. He is only by choice. And this choice is the beginning of his definitive identity. When Sophia awakens and there's no turning back, there is a point on the path of the draw where there are no more doubts, no more internal negotiations, no more attempts to return to what was comfortable. This point does not come with applause. It does not arrive with external recognition. It arrives as a silent certainty that settles in the chest and says, without words, that the old life is over. Sophia awakens as an inner light that can no longer be extinguished, and when this happens, the empath understands that he has never been weak for feeling too much. It was never exaggerated for realizing too much. He was never inadequate for loving deeply. He was just living a version of himself that had not yet crossed his own shadow. Now he has crossed. Carl Jung described individuation as the process of becoming who one has always been, but who was covered by the expectations of the world. The empath that reaches Sophia stops living as a reflection of the needs of others. He fails to mold his essence to avoid abandonment. He fails to measure his worth by the permanence of others. There is a new serenity. It's not euphoria. It is not impulsive enthusiasm, it's stability. He looks to the past and is no longer ashamed of his old self. Feel compassion. He understands that that identity that begged for love was just trying to survive. He understands that his sensitivity was, for a long time, an attempt to maintain bonds, and he understands that nothing was in vain. But he also knows that he cannot return. Sophia does not allow regression, because when consciousness expands, the return becomes impossible. The empath begins to realize that many relationships were sustained by his own insecurity, that many connections were fueled by fear, that many silences were accepted out of necessity. Not now. Now he can stay in an environment without getting lost. He can love without abandoning himself. He manages to withdraw without guilt. He can say no internally without feeling that he is cheating on someone. This is the most dangerous transformation, not because it generates conflict, but because it generates emotional independence. And emotional independence cannot be manipulated. The loner who has reached Sophia does not seek to prove anything. He doesn't try to convince anyone of his evolution. He simply lives differently. Its presence is firmer. His gaze is calmer. Your energy doesn't run behind. He discovered that being a rare soul does not mean being misunderstood forever. It means accepting that few will walk at the same depth, and that's okay. He no longer feels urgency to be validated. He no longer feels anxious to be chosen. He no longer feels afraid of not being enough. He became enough for himself. And this is the definitive liberation. The old identity is dead. The version that lived to be needed no longer exists. What remains is someone who is aware of his own light and also of his own shadow. Someone who doesn't deny their dark parts, but also doesn't allow them to rule their life. Sophia is that integration. It is the union of the sensitive with the strong. It is the union of love with the limit. It is the union of solitude with plenitude. And when this happens, the empath is no longer just someone who feels deeply. He becomes someone who chooses deeply. Choose where it is. He chooses where he invests his energy. He chooses when he approaches. He chooses when to walk away. There is no more despair. There is discernment. And perhaps the most profound reflection is this: the empath was never destined to live dependent on the approval of others. He was destined to go through the pain, integrate the shadow, and be reborn with consciousness. The most dangerous of the lonely is not the one who has been rejected by the world. It is the one that no longer depends on it to exist. If you feel that something old has died inside you, fear not. Maybe it's not a loss. Perhaps it is spiritual maturity. Perhaps it is the beginning of your own individuation. Because when Sophia awakens, there is no going back to ignorance. There is only presence. There is only wholeness. There is only the silent peace of those who have finally chosen themselves.